Hello and welcome to Electoral Dysfunction. It's a bittersweet podcast for us today. I actually think it's not even bittersweet, it's just really sad. Crying.
Very sad.
We'll come on to why in a minute. I've just landed back from Washington, D.C. I was there with the new Prime Minister at the NATO conference. We'll talk about that. But first, Jess, Ruth, have you recovered from the election yet? Ruth?
I mean, I think it was a wholly different type of evening for me than it was for Jess. In terms of doing the through the night coverage with you on Sky, which I enjoyed very much, Beth. I mean, as much as you can.
Jess, have you recovered? Well, you haven't just recovered, you've sawn off into space.
Yeah. I haven't really caught... Last night, I slept for a full night for the first time. I haven't really properly had a full night's sleep since the election.
We've got lots to get through, including how has the Prime Minister dealt with his first week? What was President Biden like in person? Yes, I saw him with my own eyes, and some news of our own. So let's get on with it. Jess has a new job. She's now a member of the government. So sadly for us, she won't be able to do the podcast. So that's the sadness. But the happiness is that she's got a great new job in which she will hopefully be transformative for millions of women's lives. Yeah. So, swings and roundabouts.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like, we are genuinely stoked for you. We're really, really happy for you. And also slightly sad for us. Is that allowed?
Yeah, I feel I'm happy for me and sad for us. And I think you should save your applause until I've actually delivered something. Although I think that every day you'll be able to see my fingerprints on things, including on some of the stuff today.
And also, Jess, let's be honest here. You're either going to say something and get sacked or walked out within a year anyway, and we can have you back.
100%. I mean, I'm totally sackable, aren't I? I mean, let's face it.
I mean, you're on watch.
I'm going to put it another way. You're in hot demand. That's how I'm going to frame this. So you have been appointed a minister in the Home Office this week. So tell us what you're going to be doing.
So I am the minister in charge of safeguarding and violence against women and girls. So that is human trafficking, sexual exploitation, domestic violence, sexual violence. And it's because the Labour Party set a mission, a really, frankly, ambitious mission, promised to halve the incidences of violence against women and girls within a decade. Now, obviously, that relies on us being there for a decade, or at least doing enough work in the next 5 years to make sure that the ground is set. So I'm essentially there to make sure that we do everything possible to make it so that mission is achieved.
Also, you're being a little bit modest there, Jess. You basically dangled Keir Starmer by his ankles until he put that in the manifesto.
To be honest, you're right that it was me and Yvette Cooper, the now Home Secretary. And now I have to refer to her sometimes as the Home Secretary because the civil service, they are weirdly obsessive about the title thing. Yeah, so Yvette Cooper and I, wrote the mission, but we were pushing at an open door. I was actually a little bit I was expecting more of a battle. I was expecting to be no, I'm going to keep pushing back. And then they just were yeah, okay. I was oh God, because, Keir Starmer, funnily, I knew Keir Starmer through work before we were both elected in 2015 because I was working in rape crisis and he was the director of public prosecutions and he was changing quite a lot of the policy on how they handle rape cases. So it is a world that he knows, cares, and he fundamentally wants it to change. So you're right. There was less dangling, but it was us that fought for it to go in.
So that is it. Jess is going into government. I am delighted for you, Jess. It's been your life's work. Oh. You've done it in opposition. Uh-huh. You were the shadow minister for it. You obviously had to resign a few months ago over Gaza. You felt you needed to do that because you couldn't stick with the government policy. You remember everyone about collective responsibility, which means if you're serving in government, you have to toe the party line. And if you feel you can't, you have to resign.
Genuinely, Beth and I have been speaking about this while you were off conquering worlds. And we are so, so happy for you. And also happy that it's under the Home Office's auspices because that's quite a hefty department. It's got a lot of clout. Yeah. And also that Yvette Cooper transferred, so you've got a good boss, not a shit one. And like when you're a junior minister, like genuinely, like you might think that the person above you is an arsehole, and then you're in real trouble.
And you're saying just about kind of everyone suddenly referring to everyone by their titles rather than their names. So it's Yvette's now Home Secretary and Keir Starmer's now Prime Minister. When he had his first press conference last Saturday, someone asked him about, do you like being called Prime Minister? He said, you can call me Keir, which obviously everyone went, oh, call me Saul, as in the lawyer. If you know that show, you'll get the pun.
Better call Saul.
He sort of said, I don't mind. I'm happy to be called Keir. I'm happy to be called Prime Minister. He said, for the civil service, it's really important that you are the office holder. So they call you Home Secretary because it's not about you as an individual. It's the office of the Home Secretary. And for the civil service, and I guess it's because they stay, whoever comes into power, the civil servants don't change, that they're serving the office rather than the individual, right? So what do we have to call you then, Jess, from now on?
They refer to me as Minister, but I have stamped it out, I'm afraid to say.
Can I just call you Minister through this whole podcast just to annoy you?
No,
for one last time, Minister Jess. Does Danny call you Minister Mum at home now? I'd so do it.
Yeah, because Danny would repeatedly refer to me as Jess Phillips, the MP for Birmingham Yardley. I imagine he'll come back with some sort of hilarious title for me. I've said to the people who are working in the team around me that I much prefer for people to call me by my name. And they were like, okay, if that's what you're saying. It's like an operating on instruction thing. It's like the exact opposite of having children.
Jess, you have to indulge me because I just want to know how it happened. I want to know what you were wearing, where you were, what you were drinking, who made the phone call. Can you just please take me through blow by blow? Because it's not often someone gets made a minister.
No. So I was stood in the street in central London, having just been for lunch, and it was absolutely chucking it down. And I was waiting for an Uber, so I was looking at my phone, you know, the way you do, like constantly obsessively waiting for the car to move. And so I was looking at my phone and Sue Gray called me. And so I answered the phone. I was like, oh, hi, Sue, how are you? And we had a little bit of conversation about the election and stuff. And then she said, anyway, Jess, I just want to say, do you want to come back into government? I feel like I didn't give the reaction that I should have, which was sort of delight and pleasure, because I just really wasn't expecting it, and I was expecting her to be like changing an appointment time. And B, I was really anxious that I'd missed my Uber, and I was getting wetter and wetter. I was basically Rishi on the day of the election being called. I was like sopping wet.
I should explain to everyone, Sue Gray is Keir Starmer's chief of staff, right? So she used to be, I think we've talked about her before. You might remember her from the Partygate report that she did on Boris Johnson and the rest of Whitehall. But she's a very senior civil servant. And then she left government to go and be Keir Starmer's chief of staff. And she's a very handy woman to have around, not least because she understands how Whitehall works. So now she is the power behind the throne, isn't she? So she is the one phoning Jess and probably others to ask them to serve in government. But Jess, I do understand that, because sometimes when people give me really good news, but I'm not expecting, I'm like, I don't react well. And it's not because I'm not happy. It's just I don't like curveballs.
Well, it was a shock. And I sort of hesitated. And she was like, Jess. I was like, oh, no, I will. I just like behaved bizarrely, basically. But yeah, it was a shock. And then almost immediately you get this phone call from like the proprietary and ethics people, and they ask you a series of questions like, do you have shareholdings? And I was like, well, my son's got one £25 share in Greggs, which he likes to use to go into Greggs and say, I own this place. But no, I don't have massive shareholdings. And they ask you those sorts of questions.
The thing that I don't get, Jess, and you can explain to me this, because everybody that's into politics watches when there's a reshuffle and they see all the cabinet ministers go in, and you walk up Downing Street and then you come out, and then you you have people that like guide you to the department you're about to go into, and then you've got to like make a speech and people clap you in and all that sort of stuff. What's it like for the junior ministers though? Because you don't have that kind of process.
No, Yvette messaged me, and then I messaged Yvette's person and said, I am just sort of sitting here with this information. Do you want me to come somewhere? And they were like, well, you have to, after the announcement. As soon as the announcement had been made, I went over to the Home Office. I went over and And people like clap when you walk in the room, and like it was really. I mean, it was quite late, and then the next day you just go in at 9 o'clock in the morning, like you're going to work, and then it's just like you've had the job forever. I mean, I am in a very lucky position in that I've done 20 years of research. Basically, I mean, for the last 9 years, the government wouldn't pass any sort of legislation on this without talking to me first anyway. So I've been in the Home Office plenty. Whereas there are some people who are going into something and it's like fisheries. It's just like, can you name these fish?
It must have felt quite emotional, did it? Like, as you said, you've worked on this. This is really the reason you became a member of Parliament. You've done it all your life.
Yeah.
And now you're actually in government. And you can actually implement the policy. I mean, it must have felt really emotional, huh?
On the next day, when you realise, and actually, to say something good about our democracy and the transition of power, the word power being the operative word, in that immediately you are like there and decisions are coming at you and you are giving your genuine opinion on these decisions that have to be taken.
Can I ask you some quick fire questions about what it's like, right? So, do you get a red box?
Yes, but I haven't been given mine yet.
Well, tell them to get their finger out. Do you get a corner office?
Yep.
Do they already have like a nameplate on it before you get there, even though it's only been announced like half an hour before?
No, but the door was open most of the time. I don't know if... well, it says you ministers. That's your title.
Did your predecessor leave you anything or do anything? Because remember, like, when Clinton administration passed to George W. Bush, they removed all the W's out the keyboards for a laugh. Did you, like, or clearly, like, when the Chief Secretary of the Treasury changed, the government changed, he said there is no money left, you know? Like, so that sort of stuff. Did you get left anything?
No, but I, aside from the fact that I had already been talking to Laura Farris, who is my predecessor, and is a woman I had an incredibly good working relationship with, and she said, let's have a proper handover sort of thing. And I'd been, because she lost her seat in the election, so I had already been talking to her saying, I hope you're okay, because she's a woman I worked very closely with previously. I mean, I would have totally loved that if she'd, like, I don't know, left sewn prawns into the curtains or something.
Well, you don't know yet. It takes a week and a half, that does. Last question. So I remember when Sajid Javid was Home Secretary, and because the Home Secretary is a kidnap and ransom risk because of the national security element of it, he like has to inform, or did have to inform, like his close protection, and I'm sure Yvette will be the same, like when they're going to, like, they have to take someone to the corner shop to buy milk. If they're going to go for a jog, they have to kind of like book it in so someone goes with them and tell them what route they're going to go and take advice on changing a route. Do you have any of that as a junior minister in the Home Office?
You will have some of it. Nothing ever like that. I said, I don't want to live in a world where I can't just decide 5 minutes before that I want to go to the pub.
Yeah.
And they said, don't worry, it won't come to that.
Last quickfire question, if I can. How did you find time to get your nails done? They're immaculate, and that means that not only have you got a fabulous new job, but you walked in being fierce.
I did walk in being fierce. I had them done 3 days before the election.
Just because you're busy, you can't let standards slip, can you? No, you cannot.
100%.
Now, just, you go in every year, you read out the list of women in this country killed in domestic violence cases, and you land in the office and there's 3 women killed the day you arrive.
The truth of the matter is that it was inevitable. It made me feel 2 things, the sort of sadness of the inevitability of it, but also the urgency. It just made me think, well, it's a good job I'm here.
Now, the other big thing that has happened this week, which you touched upon, was the prison crisis. So as we went over to NATO, the Prime Minister comes up the plane, he does the huddle, which I can talk to you about later, and he's asked about the prison crisis, and, he just lets rip in a very un-Keir Starmer way, in which he's just talks about how horrendous it is, it's a recklessness, it's a dereliction of duty of the previous government. This is basically the fact that prisons are nearly full up. We've got 83,000 prisoners, and there's only about 700 spaces, which means there's a real crisis, because you get to the point that you can't lock dangerous people up because there's literally nowhere to put them. So they're going to have to do early release on prisoners. And Shabana Mahmood, who's the new Justice Secretary, Jess is one of your neighbouring MPs, right?
Yep.
She's announced today that the government are going to have to release people early. So instead of serving 50% of your sentence and then you can maybe be looked at by the parole board for early release, it's now 40% of your sentences, potentially thousands of prisoners could be released early to cope with overcrowding. But Jess, you've made sure, haven't you, that perpetrators of domestic violence against women and girls, are not going to be eligible for that scheme, correct?
A collective team effort of new ministers, all of us working together. And by no means is any of this perfect. I mean, this is a terrible, terrible thing that it has happened. But yes, so the exemptions now are for any of the crime types that have a domestic violence flag. So it's like stalking offences, strangulation offences, offences of breaching orders around harassment, domestic abuse related harassment. So if you've got a restraining order, a non-molestation order, and coercive control and behaviour is the closest we have to a specific crime charge for domestic abuse. And they have been exempted from release, which is a shift from what it was when the Tories were doing it. You know, it's still not something that you would ever want to be doing. And there are still things that I worry about. But I mean, you do what you can in the initial hours that you have to do it. And that isn't the end, is what I would say, is that we will now work on exactly how to make sure that as many possible safeguards can be put in place for potential victims whose perpetrators are being released. But yes, they are exempted.
I mean, the rumour is that that's one of the reasons, actually, that the election was called for July, was because the dashboard was going off on the prisons. And in terms of what Tories think they're kind of areas of policy where they do better traditionally than Labour are on economic policy, but I mean, that kind of blew up under Liz Truss. Defence, which during the course of the campaign, leaving D-Day early, slightly exploded, but also security. And the twin thing of the prisons almost being full and how many more boats try and cross the channel with the illegal immigrants in the summer than the winter. So the numbers would be quite big by the time you got to an October or November election. I've no particular insight into this, but my understanding is that these were some of the considerations as to why we had that July election.
You know, when we were over in Washington, and we'll get onto that in a sec, and it was all going quite well, and Keir Starmer's kind of the new guy on the block, and all these leaders are looking at him going, as they struggle to hold together coalitions or even win elections in their own countries, they're looking at this guy going, he's centre left and he's just got this whopping majority. But one of the things one of them said to me one of his team said to me that we're very aware this is the honeymoon. And that's the point, isn't it? That the prisons crisis, Keir Starmer can blame it on the Conservative government to a point, but actually it's going to happen. Resolving it is now his responsibility. And it was quite interesting how they pitch rolled it on that trip to make it, because they knew they were going to make the announcement. So he talked a lot about it in quite, as I said, a much more evocative language than I know Keir Starmer ever to use, to really hammer home the fact that there was this crisis in his intro that he was now going to deal with, and it was the Conservatives' fault. But ultimately, people don't like the idea of people being released early and walking around on the streets. And as much safeguarding as you put in, it might still be that someone gets through the net and then someone is attacked by a violent offender, a sexual offender. And actually, this was some of the problems that Rishi Sunak was having in the run-up to the election, wasn't it? Before he called the election, there was one Prime Minister's questions where Keir Starmer found examples of where people had been released and they shouldn't have, and really hammered him on it. Because Keir Starmer, you know, Jess, you pointed this, he was very clear that he did not want people that had perpetrated violence against women and child and sexual offences and violent offences to be released early. But you're going to have this problem as a government as well, aren't you?
Yeah, 100%. But he was, when you say Keir Starmer was clear about that, and when I say, like, you know, you definitely get a sense that there is a lot of women in ministries that are related to this that were devising it, but it was absolutely on the direction that Keir Starmer didn't want to be having to do that. Like, he didn't want that. But the thing is nothing is perfect, and what I really hope for the government going forward is that we can have those honest debates about, yes, undoubtedly there is going to be a pitch point of any of these policies, which at the moment it's easy to blame away because it's the Tories' fault that this has happened, right? But if you try and do your very best to mitigate them all, then you're in a better position. That was been my attitude all week looking at this, is that you cannot mitigate for everything, but if you can show the public that you tried to mitigate for loads of it, then I very much hope that we're going to start having those sort of nuanced conversations. And that's what it has felt like. It felt grown up, actually, all the conversations I've been in as part of it.
Ruth?
In terms of prison policy, because it's a different system in Scotland, we've had a lot of changes under the SNP. So we now have a system where nobody should be given a sentence under 12 months. You just don't go to prison. That if you've got a sentence of under 4 years, so if you've got a 4-year sentence, you can get let out after a year and a half. So you can get let up to 6 months earlier than the halfway point, and that nobody under 25 should be sent to prison. It should be taken account of in sentencing, that if there's any other appropriate sentence, you shouldn't go under 25 because your brain's not fully developed or something, which when you've got like 16-year-olds committing murder just seems to be like an inappropriate thing to be talking about. But are any of these the sorts of rules that you're thinking about bringing in for that, or have you not even got to that far yet?
No. I mean, you're fighting fire, but obviously the job being given to the Timpsons dynasty of caring about prisoners and rehabilitation makes a signal to some of these things. But if you think of the under 12-month sentence, just for that example, the vast majority of domestic abuse related crime wouldn't get more than a 12-month sentence. So you have to think, like, in principle, I get why that might be a good thing, but there has to be. I think that you have to see massive improvements in charging and convicting of these crimes before you can then start liberalising the system.
Just to say, James Timpson's an interesting guy because he's an entrepreneur. He inherited Timpson key cutting shoe mending shops. We've all used them. Anyway, he did a massive body of work on rehabilitation, bringing prisoners into the business. And Keir Starmer has made him his prisons minister. And what's interesting about that, going back to Keir Starmer selecting Jess to do violence against women and girls, he's trying to put people into jobs that he believes that they have real expertise in. So James Timpson's a very interesting appointment. And actually, I'm going to try and see if I can do an interview with him or even get him on this pod at some point. I would like that. I've asked the question and he did message me back. So, we've got to first base, James and I. Right, okay, look, we have to move on. After break, we'll talk about Starmer's visit to the White House. Now, I've just got back from Washington, D.C. I was there with the new Prime Minister for the NATO meeting and quite a lot of officials and other cabinet ministers. It was like the plane, I've never seen it as packed, like the whole administration, or quite a lot of them going over to Washington for this big NATO summit. Look, it was successful in many ways. The NATO allies agreed a new package for Ukraine, which was the aim. It's the 75th anniversary of NATO. But it did end with a bit of a gaffe from President Biden.
It was a bad one.
The worst one.
It was extraordinary. We were in a press briefing room. We're waiting for Keir Starmer to come and do his closing press conference. And we're all sitting there. And one of the journalists gets a message from the camera operator saying, President Biden's just called President Zelensky President Putin. And we're like, what? Chris Mason from the BBC knocks up Newsnight on his laptop. And so the whole lobby, we're just all watching like in slow-mo with our hands over our faces, rather like Jess is doing now, actually, watching President Biden call President Zelensky President Putin. And actually, if you look at the wide, President Zelensky is there, and I think he says something like, I'm better, but he kind of visibly reacts. And to be fair to Biden, he quickly corrects himself. But the point is, it happened in the first place at a time when the entire world is on the case of, is President Biden got the cognitive ability to remain as president? It was like through your fingertips behind the sofa, absolute cringe moment. How bad was it, Ruth?
It was bad, but I kind of in a weird way feel a bit sorry for him, because if he didn't have this intense scrutiny, actually just misspeaking about two people, it's dead easily done. And also, he has got a real history of calling people the wrong name. Like, he's done it loads. But I think the problem is, since he's 81, since we're looking at his mental acuity, and he's under such a microscope as to whether he's with it. And Beth, like, honestly, the only thing I wanted to ask you about in this podcast, coming back from the States, is, did you see him? Were you in a room with him? And is he that doddery? Is he, like, that far gone?
Yes, I was in a room with him because we went into the Oval Office. So there was a bilateral with Starmer and Biden. And so you go into the Oval Office, and I've done this before, and you get the US pat lines up and the UK pat lines up, and you run in it's like a total bum fight because you've got to get to the front. And we got to the front. I've done this 3 times now. That is a humble brag. It's just because I get to go on the trips. I mean, it was interesting, this one, because it was much shorter than normal, right? We were there for like 5 minutes. Normally, Biden would have some pre-prepared notes and he'd do a speech. This one was much more just short conversation, get them in, to get the photos, get them all out. But the thing I would say about it, Ruth, is in terms of the banter, actually, with Starmer, he was quite quick. They were joking about football, and someone asked Keir Starmer if football was coming home. And Starmer said something, yes, of course it is. And then Biden said something like, well, that's because you're the new British Prime Minister. And it was kind of, he was reacting in the moment. It was okay. But the thing is, he physically looks very old and frail. He just does, yeah? When he looks around the room, he does just look a bit vacant. And actually, I felt a bit conflicted with all of it, because the NATO summit actually became a whole issue about Biden. It wasn't really about NATO. It was everyone was watching Biden. And is Biden going to be able to run? And is Biden compos mentis? And is Biden handle the world stage? And then he did a big press conference after Starmer's press conference, which was meant to show that he could. And then within minutes, he's asked a question about whether Kamala Harris really could step up to being the president, right? The VP. There's been lots of discussion about whether she's up to the job of stepping in for him. And he says, yes, absolutely, she could. Vice President Trump could absolutely become president. And I'm now just going, oh my God, he's called President Zelensky, President Putin. And now he's called Kamala Harris, Vice President Trump, right? And again, it's a name mistake. And then the whole of the rest of the press conference, he had loads of questions about whether he was up for the job, which is just, when you're the president of the United States, a dozen questions on whether you're up to the job is kind of a death knell anyway, isn't it, right? But then when he talks about foreign policy, he's really lucid. He's got 5 decades of experience and he knows his shit, okay? But you cannot get past the fact that he just called the Vice President Trump, which of course Trump's on his own platform weaponizing. So in answer to your question, Ruth, the problem is that whether or not in the moment he seems okay, which actually with Starmer he did, you cannot undo the impression that it leaves. Like, you're literally waiting for the guy to trip up.
It's funny, and it also seems to be taking the scrutiny away from Trump as well. So I don't often talk about this, but both my parents have advanced Alzheimer's. And, when you look at some of the footage of Biden almost like cutting out in the middle of something, like he's just going blank, or that he has to be led away from something, or somebody has to point something out to him. For somebody who is very close to and around very often, in my head, that's all I'm seeing is dementia. Now, obviously, I'm not a clinician, but for anybody else in the world who's around that all the time, or has seen those symptoms, who's seen the decline of somebody really close to them as well, and has watched it up close and has been the person that has to lead somebody away, or has to finish a sentence for them, or has to help them like join things up in their head, like that's what it looks like. And the frightening thing is, that's all that's standing between us and another Trump presidency. But Trump's also displaying a lot of this that nobody's talking about at the moment, because everyone's focused on the guy who's in the job right now.
I mean, it was interesting too for Starmer, because he was doing his first prime ministerial interview round, and he had lots of messaging on Europe and NATO and Ukraine, and also he wanted to get ahead of the prisons announcement. But all of us asked him about Biden, all of us. And the way I asked it was about whether Biden was going senile, whether he was losing cognitive ability. And actually, I thought Starmer might swerve the question because this is just territory that it's difficult for any other leader to get into. But he didn't actually. He was really straight. He said, yes, I personally think it is. He said that Biden had worked at pace. He'd seen him for an hour. They covered a lot of ground. Then in the press conference later, unfortunately for Starmer, the President Putin gaffe had happened whilst he was on stage. Like, all the leaders were on stage because it's the closing seminar. So he came into this press conference with us. And of course, he just knew he was going to get this question over and over and over. I did it as, you said this to me earlier, that you thought that these criticisms were misguided or misjudged. Do you still think that? And do you have sympathy for him? Because if you're Biden now, you can't make one mistake without everyone jumping on it as proof, as Ruth was saying. Starmer batted it away by saying, look, the outcome of the trip was successful. In policy terms, Biden managed to bring everyone together to lead on it and get the outcome for Ukraine. I mean, part of it is future-proofing the situation for Ukraine vis-a-vis NATO and funding, trying to future-proof it against Trump, who's been, critical of NATO and allies' funding of NATO. The PM said it had been a successful trip. What did you make of it, Jess?
From the perspective of watching Keir Starmer on the world stage, I think it was a success for Keir Starmer, rather than being on the fringes of those meetings, which you can sort of go to in opposition or send people to the White House to do things. It's a completely different thing seeing them in that sort of powerful situation. So from that point of view, I think it was a success. I think, though, that had it not been for the Biden concerns, and I agree with Ruth, I think that you can get somebody's name wrong. I mean, everybody in the whole world names their kids wrong every time they call them out, don't they? I mean, I go through about 19 names before I get Danny's name right. But the trouble is, I think that it would have been much more like, the sort of it's about Keir Starmer being at NATO were it not for Biden.
I have to say, as a journalist, it is a fascinating story. I have to tell you as well, though, that Keir Starmer was the man of the moment. And it was so surreal. Going into the Oval Office, I was watching him and I was thinking, Keir Starmer a week ago was in a farm, in a shed in Wales, like doing a rally, then flying up to Scotland, then coming back down to England for his final campaigning days. And then he's kind of in the White House, in the Oval Office with President Biden. I mean, it must be such a head masher. There's another word for that, which I obviously can't use. But I just think, God, what a whirlwind. Like, he's hot stuff, babies. Like, all the leaders, they all wanted a piece of Keir Starmer. And that's because, in political terms, these are all political leaders, right? And he's just won this massive majority. And actually, what was interesting was part of the reason they took loads of people, because the Defence Secretary went, the Foreign Secretary went, Nick Thomas-Symonds, who is now his Europe Minister, went, right? It was like, I described it as diplomatic speed dating. Like, they just want to get round everyone. But Ruth, on the substantive issues of policy, right, you could argue, couldn't you, that one of the good things that Rishi Sunak did as Prime Minister was actually reset Britain's relationship a bit with allies after difficult Brexit prime ministers in the shape of Johnson and Truss. And actually, in terms of policy, I argued that Starmer was continuity Sunak in terms of NATO and Ukraine approach. But the thing on the 2.5%, can you explain what was going on there with the policy?
So I think, and this is going to be rarer than a hen's teeth, as I'm going to praise Boris Johnson, in that actually he established the UK as being in the front rank of allies for Ukraine, going hard, going early, trying to galvanise the international community to actually properly come out. And in a sense, actually, Rishi Sunak is continuity Boris on that. On a couple of things you were talking about. First of all, I love the fact that a Prime Minister has to go and do a rally in a shed in Wales a week before they see world leaders, because that keeps you grounded, and actually your head shouldn't be turned by your NATO summits and your G7 summits, and you've got to remember, who you're on the world stage for and what you're doing it for. And I think that's almost unique about British democracy and is very good for it. Love it.
And also some of the embassy staff were saying how they'd watched the election with some US officials, and they just could not get their head around, like, the person that's about to be Prime Minister standing next to Binny McBinface or whatever it was.
Count Binface did Rishi, I think. He did Elmo. He had Elmo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That actually makes me proud to be British.
Me too.
The thing that really sort of jerked my chain about this whole trip was because of all of this chat about Biden, and I'm as guilty as anyone. Like, the first question I wanted to ask you, as you were in a room with him, is he all there? Is that we miss so many really top-line stories. Like, the idea that Keir Starmer is the first Prime Minister of any country in the world that says, yeah, see those long-range weapons we just gave you, Zelensky? You want to fire them deep into Russian territory? You crack on, lad. Because up until now, NATO, in terms of donating troops and money and particularly weaponry, have been really, really specific about what they can and can't be used for. And that has often been about defence and about securing their own borders and driving the invading force of Russia back. It has not been about striking Russian targets in Russia. We're quite isolated now in terms of saying that, because no other country, and I get why Keir Starmer did it, and he wants to get other people on side to say the same, but this is the first Prime Minister who said that. That's really significant. That's been totally lost because everyone's going, is Biden up to it?
Can I interrupt on that? I checked that out because Zelensky tweeted about this, and I was very quickly told by some of Starmer's officials that the policy was still as it had been under the last government and that it had been over-interpreted.
I think Zelensky clearly took from Starmer's comments that they'd been given a green light here. And if they've not been given the green light, then that's a good teaching point for Keir Starmer about how far you go and what diplomatic language is used. I think the other thing that slightly got lost, and I know you tried really hard on this, was the fact that there was an announcement that there's going to be a strategic defence review, that it's going to come back within a year, which is pretty quick. John Healey's going to run it. He's the new defence minister, fair enough. The fact that he's apparently done loads of preparatory work in opposition to this, which we hadn't really seen, or certainly I'd not picked up on. And it's only when that comes back that we're going to start to be allowed to ask about the 2.5%. Now, I thought that the Prime Minister was boxing clever in not answering that question of we have to find out what we want first before we can do this, and we have an aspiration. We're absolutely going to hit the 2.5%, but we're not going to tell you when. That's only going to hold for a bit. That's not going to hold for long. He's going to have to nail his colours to the mast on that.
So I absolutely agree with you. And I tried very hard in our interview to pin him on this, in the sense that I felt that he was going into this summit. He was saying to other allies, you need to lift your defence spending to 2.5%. I have a cast iron commitment, his words, to do so, but actually wouldn't say when he would do it. And I was like, well, sorry, if you're going to do it, you need to do it in your first term, because you might not win a second term. I tried very hard to press him. Actually, Tom, who does the sketch writing in the Times, said that apparently I tried to ask him 9 times. I'm not sure. I think he was just answering. I was going, end of Parliament, end of Parliament, end of Parliament.
You're such a yappy little chihuahua when you've really got the bit between your teeth, Beth.
Yeah. But I agree with you, Ruth, and this goes back to the sort of honeymoon period to the reality, which is at the moment they're in a honeymoon period, but be it prisons or be it this issue about defence spending, if you go onto the world stage and say, I'm going to be a leader on this and I will set out a route map to doing this, I'm not giving you a time frame, but I will do it. At some point, 6 months, a year down the road, if you look to be equivocating on actually hitting the target, you are going to be accused of flip-flopping, right?
Which is a charge that's been labelled at his door before. And,
yes.
Okay, he's got this massive majority and that insulates you from so much. But again, that only lasts a set amount of time. And you've got to, during that time that you can define yourself, I always call it like choosing your own adjectives. You've got to decide what the descriptive words are about you and about your time in leadership. And, you know, he slightly got attacked as leader of the opposition for flip-flopping on lots of things. What he promised he would do for the party when he became leader to what he's promised he's going to do for the country as Prime Minister, there's a big gap. So, you know, he just needs to watch himself, I think.
The one thing I'd say about the administration, and Jess, I'm not going to, you're part of it now, so I'm not going to try and press you on stuff that, but they do actually seem aware of this stuff. Like,
oh, yeah.
They are very clear-eyed about, they have a very short window where they've got the honeymoon and they're given the space to build momentum, and then they're just going to get smashed from every which side.
I don't even think it's that. I think it feels to me like there is also this sort of 6 months to a year opportunity of doing things differently, and you've got the space to do it. And that's like, people always say government departments don't work together, or like whether it's that or whether it's like, you know, being bold on certain things. You know, it's very difficult to do in reality because so much is coming at you. But it does feel like there is this opportunity for the first stages of this new government to lean on the honeymoon for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah. And I'm going to move on, but one final thought, and Jess, I'd like your view on this. I have followed Starmer around for like 4 years, not in a stalky way, it's just my job.
Always sound stalky when you say it.
But I followed, like, seriously, I followed him around for 4 years, and I followed him from 2021 when he looked like a busted flush and really not only thought about standing down as leader, but was worried for a period of time that there might be a challenge to him. And now he's sort of sitting on this massive like pile of MPs, like king of all he surveys. What I have noticed, I noticed it in the campaign as it was closing, but also that first press conference, to how he handled himself at NATO and in the sit downs with the political editor round. It's like the Keir Starmer that I sometimes saw off camera seems to be coming on camera. It's almost like he's carried the Ming vase across the polished floor. He's got into number 10, and it feels like he's like letting rip a bit as much as Keir Starmer ever would.
Yeah. I was about to say he's juggling the Ming vase now, but maybe not juggling it, but he's not quite there yet. But I agree.
You know what I mean? Like he's a bit more confident. He's more assured.
That's the word. It's confidence.
Yeah.
He's not having to triangulate all the time to try and play defence all the time. He gets to actually front foot and say what he means. And it will be interesting, this flex, whether it continues and whether there's any blowback from that.
He definitely has got the air of a man, you know, enjoying himself seems flippant, but even just his posture and everything, his face looks different.
Yeah, he looks relieved, actually. He looks like he's got relief on his face, yeah.
Yeah, his face looks different.
I reckon that if you're a serious person, which Keir Starmer clearly is, you are daunted a little bit. And actually, the idea of going from, you know, leader of the opposition, there is a particular skill set about how you punch. And, you know, like there's an element to which any fool can knock down a barn. And you see in a lot of opposition parties that will never become government, how easy it is to make stuff up on the hoof for a cheap hit and things like that. If you're going to become the government, or you're in the top two and you might, you've got to be a bit more sensible. But you know, in terms of the freedom that you have, it's a lot more freeing to be that. But when you cross the floor and become the head of a G7 nation, arguably like the fifth most important person right now in terms of defence, economics, like all that sort of stuff in the world, on the planet. You know, if you sneeze, it gets reported in 75 different languages. There must be like a complete, oh my God, moment about that.
My kids had a term for it that when they were little, they used to call it nerve-sighted.
Oh, yeah.
I'm nerve-sighted. So you're
sweet.
nervous but excited.
We've had loads of questions about all the new MPs arriving in Parliament this week, like this one from Stuart in Devon. He says, do MPs taken over from another MP in a constituency have a kind of handover to help continue on with any ongoing issues or cases for constituents? Jess, you were nodding your head there.
Sort of. So there is a process you go through when you shut down your office as a member of Parliament who's lost or retired or just stood down, where you get in touch with all of the people you have an open case for and say, do you want me to destroy or pass over to the new person? And so that happens. That isn't like based on the personnel doing it. That is the advice you are given by Parliament, and it's also like GDPR stuff as well about people's data. So that does happen. However, you're quite likely to get a considerably better handover if you have a retiring or standing down MP from the same political party. You're likely that they've been out on the campaign trail with you. You're likely to end up with some of the same staff, if not even the same office. So in that regard, there would be a handover. But I have seen some really lovely examples, actually, where it's the other political parties handing over to somebody else, a new person, and being as helpful as they possibly can. And everybody has got 5 constituents who that, you know, somebody should give somebody a heads up about and be like, oh yeah, don't answer the phone if it's this number. Even if somebody else I didn't like took over, I might do a kindness to somebody even on that basis.
Can I quickly ask you this from Tony as well, partly because I want to know as well. Tony wants to know, as does Beth, who tells you where you sit in the Commons or Lords? Is it first come, first serve within your party block? And do you have to sit there all the time?
No.
Jess?
No, you sit wherever you want. People get like favourite seats, like Diana Johnson. She would always sit in the same place on the back bench. So people get sort of favourite places. But there is a system. On busy days, there is a prayer card system where if you go in for prayers, you can put your name. But in the Labour Party, I have to say, we don't use the prayer card system. Bums fill seats, not prayer cards. But the Tories were, as is traditional, much more traditional.
Yeah. Ruth, how does it work in the Lords?
Yeah, so there's some benches that are set aside. So like the bishops sit in a bit. So on the long side, you've got government and opposition. And when the government changes, you swap sides. The side with the bishops on it is always the government side, and that's called the spiritual side. And then the opposite side is called the temporal side. So we're off to the temporal side now. So we're not going to have windows to look at anymore because we're in opposition.
That's batshit.
Yeah, it's mental, isn't it? And then the crossbenchers and the Lib Dems sit down the end by the opposite end from where the throne is. And then on the short end away from the throne, we don't have a speaker's seat. We've got a woolsack that's a bit further in. The throne is like only the king sits there at the opening of Parliament. That's the only time that's ever used, but you've got to nod at it when you go in.
I'm going to rename my side of the office the spiritual side. Absolutely love it.
I want to be temporal, although it sounds rubbish.
Temporal sounds like you don't drink.
I did not know that.
Oh, that's true. I don't want to be that. I'll be spiritual.
Well, look, this is all we've got time for. I'm going to be watching the football on Sunday. I hope you all appreciated that I did wear an English flag for my interview with Keir Starmer.
I noted your outfit was very patriotic.
that does nothing for me, Beth.
I'd have done it for you, Ruth, as well. I'd have worn blue and white. You know what I mean?
Yeah, do you know, actually, like I quite like the England team, I have to say. I'll watch the match. I think that it's going to be a hard ask. I think that Spain team looks really good.
It does, but also what I like about it is that a lot of the goal scoring has been people who played for the Villa and the Blues. So
I should tell you also that Keir Starmer gave Joe Biden an Arsenal T-shirt, which is probably what Joe Biden did not want, but there you go. And they put 46 on the back, so he's the 46th president. So there you go. I think Biden gifted Starmer a copy of, or maybe an original of, some of the NATO accords in which
Attlee had written all the hand annotated some of the changes to it.
That's pretty cool, isn't it?
That's cool.
Yeah, that's a lot better than an Arsenal shirt.
Well, look, Jess, we're going to miss you.
Yeah.
Oh, I love you both very much, and we will still see each other. Worry not, my loves.
But don't worry, dysfunctioners. You'll still be getting a podcast every Friday, whether you want it or not. We're going to have a lot to talk about in the next few months. A new government here and what already looks like a very interesting election beginning to really kick off in the United States. We're going to cover it all. And we still want to hear from you. Email us on electoraldysfunction@sky.uk or send us your messages and voice notes on WhatsApp 07934 200 444. And with that, I'm going to have to say goodbye. And goodbye, Jess. It's been an absolute bloody blast.
Goodbye.
Oh,
Bye,
man.
Jess.
Gonna miss you.
Farewell.
Gonna miss you, but we'll be round. Yeah, we'll be round later. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. See you later.
Right, bye.
Bye.
Ciao.